Hello and welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment, or a review if you like. I am your host, Max, and with me as always is my co-host, Troy, and behind the scenes doing his thing is our producer, Jay. Today's episode covers Mutant Chronicles Warzone, a game that some people may have heard of, but a lot of people may not have. But I'll get into how I'm not certain as to how popular the game actually is in a little bit. But it is a skirmish miniatures game about brutal corporate warfare in a techno-fantasy dystopian future. And while it's most commonly understood to be kind of a confused with and or at one point competing with Warhammer 40,000, it really is its own thing in a lot of ways, and in fact is a spin-off of the Mutant Chronicles role-playing game.
Yeah, it's really interesting because something you said to me offline was like, it doesn't feel the same type of like character or nature of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Like you had another comparison.
Like superficially, I suppose one could make that association because it's got big muscly guys with big guns and giant shoulder pads.
Totally.
And what might be power armor, but in fact, it has a lot more of a cyberpunk setting in it. And in a way, a good way to think about it might be to think of it like Shadowrun, but without the high fantasy elements and more interplanetary travel.
Right.
And it's not so much, I mean, it definitely has a cyberpunk focus, but I wouldn't say that it leans quite that hard on it the way that Shadowrun might. And it doesn't have magic, but it definitely has supernatural things in it. It's maybe a horror setting, kind of at its edges.
If you look at the Dark Legion as a faction, I think that fits.
Like that specifically. Yeah. And even elements of the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
But we'll get into the factions in a little bit. So the history of the development of this thing kind of goes as follows. It was created in 1995 by Target Games, a Swedish developer, if I'm correct in that. And it's basically set into the Mutant Chronicles universe. And the first edition of the game is more like a skirmish game that focuses on individual units, with some units also having squads of infantry around them, kind of making up what we consider to be their special ability or part of that. It's set in a dystopian world where mega corporations fight for territory while the Brotherhood, which is like a religious organization, tries to stop the machinations of the evil Dark Legion, which are encroaching from the outside of the solar system and are basically demons.
Okay.
So this goes into the idea that I'm like, there's a popularity of this game, but I don't know if it's properly served or not large enough to have a reasonable critical mass. But the first edition of the game, again, focused on small-scale battles. The second edition of the game, little unbalanced, tad broken, but what it attempted to do, and in some ways might successfully have done, is broaden it out to include much more of a larger, like in the way that Warhammer 40K would occupy, with multiple vehicles and larger and more various aircraft and things like that. The first edition does have mentions of things like tanks and stuff, but it's really not focused around that. Second edition really brings that in, but some people question the how smoothly it did that. Then Target Games goes bankrupt, disappears, and this would have been in the probably around 2000 or 99. And I actually equate that the 1999 date to me is the golden peak of Games Workshop. So the fact that Target Games is struggling kind of parallels this.
Oh, okay. Got you.
I think there might be a connection there where a lot of people are really buying into Games Workshop, at least within the wargaming hobby. And that's when GW is putting out its best stuff. I mean, in my opinion, but I still think that's their golden era. They may have another one. Who knows? I'm still waiting. And then in 2004, there is a failed revival for what is called Ultimate Warzone.
Right.
It attempts to try to correct at least it claims to correct the inadequacies of second edition, but the company folds in on itself before anything can really happen. Then, once again, Warzone Resurrection 2013 from Prodos Games. Don't know these. Maybe they're still around. A major overhaul, modernizing the mechanics, but then discontinued. Maybe lack of interest. Don't know. And then finally, 2023, which sounds like a cyberpunkish year, we have, I guess, Res Nova Games. And they put out a Warzone Eternal. And I've seen this kind of slapped up in a few places. I don't know if it's still happening. But then I've always heard about these little enclaves of Warzone players. Some in Sweden. Apparently there's quite a few in Ireland that, like, oh, that's interesting. All the places that it might be. And then I myself have inherited from a friend of mine who was really into it. I have so much of this stuff. I have like a starter box set of, they must be second edition plastics,
right,
of Bauhaus and Imperial. Like, and we're talking bags of sprues. So I'm never going to run out of that. I mean, I'm still building them. And I use them for things like Space Weirdos and other kinds of model agnostic games. They're handy because they look like kind of teched out World War I British and German troops. So the theming writes itself. I could pit them against each other, you know, red versus blue style. I'm fantastic. Also, I remember I had a weird situation where I was cleaning out some stuff from my mom's place, and I went down to the lobby of her building, and there was this little area where they put up like little like flyers and stuff, and it was also known as a part of the building where people would ditch like household items that other people might want, but not like necessarily throw it in the garbage. I saw a whole couch in there one time, so people were abusing the hell out of this. But one time, I found this box of just random miniatures. And some of it, I say quite a lot of it, was Games Workshop stuff. And I cleaned up some of those. I have 2 squads of Space Marines here that are kind of leftovers. Some of them have beaked helmets.
Right on.
Good get, right? But then I realized mixed in with that, there were Brotherhood troops from Warzone in there, and like metal ones. So I'm like, man, this game haunts me. And then my friend who was really big into it, he decided he wasn't getting enough play out on it and asked me if I wanted it. So I have, at least in my hand right now, one edition of the role-playing game. Not exactly sure which one it is, but it's probably a second edition or later. And I have a big pile of the Doomtrooper card game as well, which I should probably do a review on because I've got like 6 decks of that.
Oh, wow. We got to cover that.
Anyway, that's my own personal experience with this. And I felt at some point I had to get around to getting into it and explaining like something of it. And I should probably play it. Unfortunately, Troy lives in another city than me, so we don't often meet up except to play online. We might be able to do that anyway, using something like Tabletop Simulator. But
yeah.
Digressions aside, yeah, this game it exists and it continues to exist. So the materials of the game, first edition's got nice full color printing, like it even has page colors on it, decent font. Good sizing. I found it pretty easy to read through, and it's not super complicated as a game. I mean, it's funny that people said that it needed like modernization or streamlining, and I think that might have more to do with the initiative activation system. But there's some really cool things about that I'm going to get into. But yeah, it's a good looking book. It's got some good art. The most famous artist associated with this franchise is a guy named Paul Bonner, and look him up, but the style of art he has is both saturated in color, but also really dynamic and almost realistic, but kind of cartoony.
Would you put it on a spectrum between like, okay, you know how Games Workshop does their Battlefield art, and then you have something more like comic book art? Where would you throw the dart?
it kind of sits nicely in the middle. Like, I actually quite like his stuff, but it is a very specific tone to it. He's also done like high fantasy stuff. I want to say that it almost, and this is going to sound like a detraction, but like it almost has a Saturday morning cartoon vibe to it. But if you dialed up, like if you added that sort of dark fantasy, like 80s movie poster to quality to it.
Oh, that's cool.
Right? Like I'd love to see this guy like do a painting of like He-Man, because I bet it would look crazy.
That would be sick. Yes.
Because there's this exaggerated quality that he has to his work that works internally with it. But I think given to the wrong franchise, it might color it the wrong way. I mean, I'm sure he can tailor his style or whatever.
Yeah.
But like, it's very action movie. You know, like it feels like an 80s action movie poster, but with the craziest stuff you've ever seen happening on it. The miniatures that I have, so I have some of the first edition metal ones, which are pretty good in comparison to their contemporaries. I'd say they're about the same. And the plastic ones are also very sharp. I really like my little goon squad of guys in what are like German World War I peaked helmets with gas masks. I honestly think the Bauhaus miniatures could do as a substitute if you were playing Death Corps of Krieg.
Oh, cool.
Like if you squint, they're pretty similar. The shoulder pads are maybe the weird part about them. Everyone's got shoulder pads in this game, by the way. Like huge, like you lose the guy's head between them.
That's very funny.
It's just sort of like take that Space Marine aesthetic and then put it on everybody. Not entirely. They're obviously sleeker units. But anyway, what are your feelings about your sort of surface glance at this?
Because I spent a lot of time with the Games Workshop system, I always felt like, oh, I already have something. I don't need this. But what I never recognized was that it's not the same thing. It's not like... To make a comparison today, there are other companies that make products that are within squinting distance of Games Workshop, and you're like, oh, I can see what you're doing. You know, not to name anybody, but like there's like people who are making games that are adjacent Games Workshop as like a close alternative.
Yeah.
But MC Warzone is not that. It's quite a different game in its own right. And I think that is something that I kind of missed out on. Like I found some of the models to be of up and down quality, depending on like what area you're looking at, or if it's a plastic or a metal sculpt. Like there's a little bit of that, but nothing that other sculptors haven't dealt with either, right? Like everybody has off sculpts. That happens to every single company that makes miniatures.
Oh yeah.
So you can't act like, oh, MC Warzone had a bad sculpt. That's terrible. It's like, so does GW, man. Like there's been lots of weird ones. So let's, give credit where it's due. And I think where this game is different was specifically in some of the primary mechanics that you'll get into. But that kind of gave it a very different tactical feel than the third edition of 40K that was out at the time.
Let's start with the primary mechanics, and we'll start with the activation system. This game does a unit for unit activation as opposed to a side for side. There's a fun quirk to the original game. So this activation is broken up into two parts: nomination and activation. Now, when it's your turn, you pick one unit and then the other player picks a unit. But what you can actually do is nominate your opponent's unit and force them to take their action before you, but then sacrificing your own your own nomination on that turn. Weird thing about this game is you can nominate any unit on the board, whether you control it or not, though the person controlling that unit is the one that decides what it does.
But it's a way to force an anti-tank weapon to have to go before you're going to move a tank out. It's like a way to control or draw activations out of stuff that you are going to need to engage with. So it's kind of clever. I don't know what it's meant to represent, if you know what I'm saying, like in terms of like, yeah, it's very gamist, but I think it does a cool thing in regards to the flow of the action sequence, because it gets you in a lot of alternating activation games. What you'll do is you'll just park a good thing in a good spot and wait for the thing that you need to go, so you can just hook around the corner and waste it. You know, like you have a very like counterable action you can take in an alternating activation game, and this really interrupts that. So you can't just wait in the pocket with a good unit and do the move at the last second that's ideal for you. You might have to activate it in a priority just to ensure you get it at a good moment, as opposed to waiting for your opponent to give you a bad moment to use it.
Yeah, so that's one way that it shakes up the idea of a you go, I go situation, is that anyone can nominate any unit to move. So it's like, well, I don't want to step this squad out to get shot up by, say, the heavy gunner over here. So I'm going to activate the heavy gunner, and then that player is going to have to decide, okay, well, I have to do something with him.
Yep.
And maybe that something is waiting, which is effectively like Overwatch. But at the very least, now that squad knows that that's what's going to happen there. And you may force their hand so that your other squad now can move up because you know that one isn't going to move.
Yeah.
You're right. It is gamist, but I actually think it's interesting or fun in the way that it's gamist, because that's the thing. If you're going to break the immersion of a game, it better be entertaining.
Yes, I agree.
Or at least thought-provoking, right? You want to create an interesting problem. And I think this game, a lot of the mechanics in this game are sort of like, I don't know how to say it, it's like setting up an interesting problem to solve by kind of throwing a wrench into things. That's the most obvious way that this system does it, but it's kind of built throughout the whole thing to work that way. An important thing to note that is also an interesting quirk of this game is that it's a D20 resolution system, roll under.
Very curious.
If you think about other games, war games up to this point, D6s are pretty much the primary way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And most people associate a D20, especially at this era, as being a Dungeons and Dragons thing.
For sure they do. I absolutely agree.
And also the Dungeons and Dragons thing is usually a roll up, like a roll over system. But this one is actually based on modifiers like a percentile system, and it's about rolling under that. So ones are awesome. And in some cases, depending on what action you do, they can actually give a bonus effect. And rolling a 20 is terrible and can sometimes cost an action or have nasty repercussions. So yeah, it has that crit miss fail or critical hit, critical fail or fumble effect in the game.
Yep.
Another thing that it does that you certainly would not often see in a larger scale war game is that it uses action points, of all things. So anybody who's played like the Fallout franchise, like the original Fallout franchise, Fallout 1 and 2,
right?
Maybe Fallout Tactics, depending on how you consider it, whether you're using active battle time or if you're using the traditional turn-based. But it's the idea that you have a number of points and different actions equate to spending those points. And it's fairly intuitive. Like, for instance, if you're going to shoot at somebody, that would be a point. But there's actions to aim and shoot, so that's 1 and 1.
Mm-hmm.
And most units have around the same amount of action points. I actually didn't make a note about exactly what that average was, but I think it's between like the 3 to 5 range, depending on how important the unit is. There's army lists in here. Yeah, so a lot of the basic troops and sergeants have 3 actions, and there's a few other characters, like the more individual characters, that have higher ones than that.
Oh, very cool.
I think there's some like kind of like the cyborgs and the assassin type characters might have 4.
Oh, yeah.
But I'd say 3 is about right. So it allows you to move a short distance, aim, shoot. Some of these things might cost 2 points. Some cost 1. Some might take your whole turn, depending on what it is. But rather than it being, say, oh, this is an action that takes the full turn, or it has some conditional thing like, say in Chain of Command, where a machine gun emplacement can move, but it can't shoot on the same turn that it moves, unlike other units. So that's, I guess, what you'd call a conditional statement. In this case, it's all numerical. In regards to like war games and skirmish games, like how do you feel about AP action points, at least as it's used in this context?
Like when you're dealing with individuals, I can see it working well, especially when it's used in like a cool impulse system mechanic, right? Where you get like several APs and you're not locked into a character having all of them, but you get to spread them out. Like I like those types of creative uses of them. But when you're trying to scale it up, I find AP becomes something that you kind of rely on doing rote combinations instead of spending it dynamically like you're supposed to. Because when you have like 10 units you have to do AP on, you kind of just remember like, move and shoot's enough. Let's just do that. Instead of actually engaging with the specific mechanics.
Right.
Where in some approaches to AP, you might spend them more with a more bespoke intent, or there might be so few of them that each one of them is more valuable in its own application.
Yeah, that level of granularity. And I often wonder if second edition, I don't know how it compensated for that, because the whole idea of what second edition tries to do is bring more units to the table and bigger units to the table.
Yeah.
And some things like tanks are considered to have like different operators for different procedures.
Yeah.
Right? Like the driver and the gunner are, I think, operating on their own initiatives. I mean, and that makes sense, but you could see that could get really cumbersome pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the thing that this game wins on, in my opinion, is how straightforward the hit resolution system is. So let me see if I can walk through what it's like to shoot another unit in this game. So if you've got clear line of sight, we'll just assume that there's no other factors in here except perhaps cover, which I'll explain in a bit. You roll under your character's range characteristic. And actually, you know what? Before I get into that, I should probably get into what all of the unit characteristics are, because there are a substantial number of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe no more than like an early edition of Warhammer would be, like, like the 2-letter stat line.
Yes.
Populates.
Yeah.
Very similar to that. So you've got close combat skill. I think we can all imagine what that's for. Weapon skill. That's for your shooting. Power. That's kind of essentially magic or supernatural energies. Leadership, which kind of is what it sounds like. So you can pull units out of panic, but you can it's also used to do certain kind of skill checks like spotting hidden units. And yes, there is a stealth mechanic in this game. You have AC, which is your actions, and that's, as I said, how many things you can do in a turn. Wounds, how tough are you? Strength is a modifier to melee damage, and that's about it. But occasionally, I think there may have been other rules that have to do with like equipment carry. Movement sounds fairly explanatory. There's a standard measure of movement, and then every point of MV you get, you can move that many at the cost of your AP. Usually those numbers are the same. It's usually an AC 3 and an MV 3. But in some cases, some units might have more AP, but they can't move more than their move. And again, this is like a special unit thing. And then you've got your point cost, which is your balancing mechanic, battle value, whatever equivalent you want to think of. Yeah, so the essential mechanic is you line up your shot, roll under your missile weapon skill, so your MW, and if you do that, you have hit. Then what your opponent does, or I suppose you could do this for them, but it's probably easier for them because they have the information in front of them. They roll their armor minus the damage of your weapon. And then if they are able to roll under that number, then they save from being hit, the idea being that it hit the armor, and don't receive a wound.
Okay.
Most of your basic units have a wound of 1, which means if they get hit, like we're talking like troopers, and even sergeants, if they get hit, they're obliterated. This is your basic squad.
Yeah, one and done.
One and done. And that's, I mean, for the economy of a game like this, that makes sense. Obviously, more special individual units might have 2 or 3.
Yep.
But if we're just thinking about 2 squads facing off of each other, usually the leader of that unit is whatever, it's usually the sergeant, which is whatever one has the highest leadership score. And then it's whoever is the least screwed up, if that's not the case.
Okay. Classic.
If 2 squads are butting into each other, like, if they're taking shots at each other, normal attacks. So maybe you can tell me if there's another game that does this, because I swear I know that this is a thing in other games, but there's a target priority. So you can only hit the nearest unit in your line of sight. So if there's guys behind them, you can't actually target them. You have to target the guy in front, unless you have an ability that allows you to target other units.
There's lots of ways that's been implemented. Like you can only target the closest 2 units unless it's a tank, or you can only target the closest unless you pass a willpower. All types of implementations of that. But I think it's kind of interesting as a mechanic because it has a more positional element to the gunfight. Because you can't just like shoot the guys that you want to shoot every time. You have to engage who you're relationally positioned towards, thereby forcing you to commit other dudes to get into new positions or reposition the dudes that are already committed, right?
Yeah, and some skills and or equipment aid in negating that rule. And this is especially true of squads, because you cannot actively target the sergeant before eliminating all of the troopers.
So the troopers they're like armor for the school sergeant, sort of.
Yeah, they're armor and firepower for the individual, which is the sergeant.
Yeah.
And the sergeant isn't like amazingly better. Like, again, they have a lot of the same thing. They have the same armor value, same strength, same move. I think the only thing that really sets them apart is their missile weapon and their leadership are like 2 points higher, at least in most cases. Depends on your faction. If we're thinking about a baseline and they use the blood berets as their example, that's sort of the function of those units. And you want to think of them like one unit, even though it's a bunch of guys.
Yeah.
And some of them have tactical things where you can break them off to do something, but for the most part, it's just like a big bundle of dudes that run around and get shot.
Yeah, dudes with rifles that take wounds.
Yeah. And they are kind of bullet sponges. At least that's tactically how you'd use a squad.
Yeah.
There's command range. So, as I said, there are squads and squad units. The leader of a unit kind of counts as part of the squad and also part of what are called individuals, which are, I don't want to call them hero units because they could just be a guy with a fancy gun that operates on their own, but they activate separately rather than you activating the leader and then the leader activates the other units. Here's an interesting thing so you have that stat line for your units, but then you also have a stat line for the equipment that they have.
And this is for like the weapons and stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like, again, there's close range as a stat. So some weapons might have both close range and maximum range. Some of them might penalize you for being within close range. Other ones are only close range weapons. Then you have your MX, which is your maximum range. Then you have your range modifier, which basically is like the degree of accuracy when you're outside of that range.
Oh, okay.
And then you have your damage. And then cost, which is sort of equivalent to points. It's literally the same thing. Sorry. The interesting thing about this, and this is very much from that idea that this is a skirmish game, is that you can equip a guy with a certain kind of gun. And for the most part, I think it's pretty WYSIWYG. Like, whatever guns they have on their models, we just assume that that's the default. But if you were to put a different gun onto a unit, it would change their point cost accordingly. So you want to think of the unit and the equipment as kind of an addition on top of the original stat line, but also bringing its own stats, like things like damage.
Yeah, like and range attack or how much AP it costs to use it, stuff like that.
Yeah, and damage is more like armor penetration than it's like hit points, because most of these units don't have more than like 2 or 3.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Okay, that's good. That's a good point.
There's a morale system, and in fact, there's an interesting part about a lot of the winning conditions is that when a unit is, I believe if it's panicked is the condition, they'll have to be attempt to be rallied. But if all the units are panicked or dead, that opponent loses. So you don't actually even have to kill people. You just have to drive them into the fetal position or kill them.
Well, that makes such an interesting perspective on it, because it puts this tension of like, you need to be able to keep your units in fighting shape. You can't just run them down and let them get pinned and just like have 4-pin squads putting up a token resistance. It's like you have to keep your line intact. And as the enemy, it gives you an incentive not to just do the classic wargamerism of focus fire, all units shoot one guy, all units shoot the next guy, because it's like, oh, I've already suppressed these guys. I got to move on and try and panic these other dudes now.
Yeah, you want to think of a suppressed unit or like a panicked unit in this to be essentially dead but could be revived.
Yeah.
And you really have to make the question about, and I believe they're actually harder to hit when they're in that state. So they're down if you want to take the equivalent of bolt action.
Yeah, totally.
They immediately go into a defensive mode where they can't be activated unless they're picked up. Facing matters in this game. So again, like a skirmish game, because it is. There's a few ways to mark facing. The way that the book describes marking it is with, like, put a little arrow on the base, like paint a little triangle to show which way the facing is.
Okay.
But the way that I see a lot of people do it is they paint one half of the base one color and either leave the other half unpainted or paint it a different color. Because a unit, it basically has a 180-degree split in its point of view, and it only has forward or back. So you're not dealing with flanks or, left or right adjacent or anything like that. They're either behind you or in front of you. Okay, so setup, you have a terrain table. It's probably going to be maybe a little over, you're going to have your standard rectangle. It's going to be like 12 inches to one side for your deployment zone, and then it can be as little or much as that as you want. The way they have it set up, at least in the image, is that you're fighting the short ends of a rectangle rather than the wide.
Okay.
Which we could probably have a beyond the book about, like, terrain and deployment, because there are different schools of thought as to, do you want to take a long time to reach your opponent, or do you want to have more options across the table?
Yeah.
But then doing it from the wide ends leaves some parts of the table untouched in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
Opinions may differ on that. You have to build a battle list, as you do in any of these games, and that's, of course, where your point cost comes in. And the idea, obviously, is to balance the numbers. They even have rules for terrain placement if you want to just do a quick start game. And essentially, you roll a D20 or two D20s, and then whichever player gets the lower, so you roll against each other. Whoever gets the lower score gets to place the first piece of terrain, and then it alternates.
And that would be more the competitive option, I guess?
Yeah, I guess it's to add a level of game balance. So you agree on how many pieces of terrain or terrain features you're going to have in there, and then put them down.
Yeah.
And you just alternate placing. I've done similar things with people when I've been playing, like, a World War II game, and it's not based around a scenario. As I said, there's an initiative system. You basically roll your dice. Whoever gets low goes first. Then the first player nominates their unit, theirs or someone else's. The unit activates. You spend as much of the AC characteristic as you can. Some units can activate, like, as I said, a squad can activate all of the units essentially at once around it. So they're thought of as using all of their AC at the same time.
Right.
And then they state that the basic, like, skirmish game involves suppressing the opponent unit, but you can also play for victory points. You could put up a specific scenario. They have a few where it's like you have to complete a mission, or whoever can reduce the point level of the opponent within a certain number of turns. Whoever can cut the other opponent's point limit in half. There might be an objective, like capture the flag effectively, and whatever else you can think of. I can think of King of the Hill. Probably be a good one.
Oh, yeah. That would work really well with a game like this.
Yep. Or a center flag push. So kind of, it's a capture the flag, but turned on its head. You're trying to put the flag into the opponent's zone.
I prefer that's regular capture the flag. Like, get the flag and run the touchdown. I much prefer that as opposed to the get it and retreat with it.
Yeah, because you're moving back into your defense zone, right? Like, you're reaching out and grabbing it and pulling it back into the area that you control. So not as exciting.
I've played both in paintball,
Yeah, same.
And I just kind of feel like it's more fun when after you get it, the game isn't like, oh, it's kind of over now as that guy runs back. And it's like, no, the game's on now. Now they're coming for us. And we got to get the flag back. And then we got to go for them.
Yeah,
it's just more dynamic.
The winning team has to forward more risk to complete the objective.
I like when winning has risk, right?
Yeah.
Taking the lead puts you at risk is more fun than taking the lead secures you, unlike real life.
Much like real life. So yeah, you need to have line of sight to shoot something. This is usually fairly obvious, depending on the amount of cover. If a unit is not fully in cover, but clearly behind something, then their cover value, soft or hard, traditional things. So soft being things like bushes, hedges, like a wood wall or fence or something like that.
Right.
It adds a -2 to the hit, or is it to the damage? Let me just double check. It's to the hit, and then hardcover is to is a -4, so just twice that. Hopefully, I got that right. It might be damage. I could see that being the case. Anyway, basically, yeah, you do the thing that I said, where the weapon's damage is subtracted from the armor of the unit. They roll. If they don't, then they take a wound. If the wounds exceed their wound limit, they're blipped off of the table. But that's not the only way. They could, obviously, being shot at has a psychological effect, I think, even if you don't take damage. So it makes it so that I didn't get hit, but I probably want to move that guy.
Absolutely. And that's important. Like, it's not getting damaged that creates morale issues. It's getting shot at that creates them.
So now here's an interesting one about how weapons do rapid fire damage in this game. So if a weapon, usually if it does rapid fire, or if at least it has a damage modifier on it, it'll sometimes have a times, like an X next to the number, and then a number following that. So it'll have damage X2. That means that after the shot has been lined up and fired, then your opponent has to make that many saves.
Oh, one hit, multiple saves.
Yes. So you do the damage minus the armor, and then if it's, say, it's ×3, then you have to do that 3 times. And I believe if you fail multiple of them, you actually take a wound for every one of those that happens.
Oh, okay. So that's how, like, a machine gun can put down a larger number of guys.
Yes, but machine guns are also pretty unwieldy. So we can get into the specialized actions. There's a bracing thing, which is kind of like aiming, but rather than aiming, increasing your ability to hit the target, this removes the penalty for shooting.
That's cool.
Right. So if you try to shoot from the hip with like a huge heavy machine gun, you're going to have a hard time of it. This game has rules for sidearms. So they don't suffer a penalty up close, because there is actually a close range penalty for a lot of two-handed like rifles and stuff like that. But if the character has a sidearm, they basically can use it like a melee weapon as well as at a certain range. But it's usually not as far.
That's really cool.
And I really like that aspect because, as I've complained in other episodes, I don't like it when the sidearm is just a weaker gun that doesn't do anything, because then why would people have them?
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's just like, it's a gun that does less damage and less or less range. Like, unless there's something bad happening to my main weapon, why would I use it?
Yeah.
There are shotguns. Okay, here's a question. I have this debate in my brain a lot of the time about shotguns and how they're supposed to work. So the scatter on a shotgun is biased obviously toward the middle, but then as it expands outward, it can be quite wide. I believe, as a general rule of thumb, for every yard travel forward, it moves 1 inch apart. But again, with the biasing. So is it worth using a template?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, my problem with templates is that, like, they're sort of unwieldy and require player agreement under what falls under them. However, they're super thematic and fun. So if you're already playing a narrative style game, like in Heresy or something, right? You're already playing a game that pretty much doesn't fit a typical competitive format. So sure, put a flamethrower template in there. Why not?
Yeah.
And in Clash of the Fringe, another game we've mentioned before, that even has templates for the beaten area of like assault guns, like assault rifles, I mean to say. So it's like there's templates even for like automatic weapons in that game. So there's lots of different examples of their use, but they do lead to interpretive moments, you know, which sometimes it's just easier to say a shotgun does D3 hits as opposed to put the template down and see, oh, it's 2 guys. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking from a mechanical point of view where it's like, why does a shotgun spread? It doesn't necessarily spread because it's designed to hit more than one person.
Right.
It's actually, most times you have a burst, and this is true of like flak cannons as well. It's more to be more accurate by increasing the number of projectiles, but the intention is to usually knock one target out. It requires less accurate aiming to get a similar effect.
See, one thing about templates is they usually mean you don't have to shoot to hit. They just kind of get what's under the template. So that could be really applicable for a weapon like that.
In this case, it's still a normal attack, but it doesn't operate on range. It operates within that template. I mean, yeah, if two guys are in melee combat and you fire a shotgun at them, you're probably going to hit both of them. Like, you don't get to pick or choose which one you hit.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's wide enough that I'd worry about measuring it, depending on the range. But then, like, once you get far enough out, like, say you go beyond, like, if you're at 80 to 100 yards, like, is even one of those pellets, like, maybe one or two of those pellets might hit something. But the scatter is so wide, it's like not enough of the force is really going to do anything unless it, like, hits you in the head.
Right. I like the Necromunda range band concept where there's a short and a long with different modifiers to hit in each.
Right.
So you can apply different penalties to different range bands to make weapons more appropriate at different distances. Like a last rifle is better further away than up close, but of course you're going to want that last pistol for when you're right around the corner from the other ganger.
My favorite interpretation of a shotgun, and also the other thing is if you put templates on a lot of other things, it might make it cumbersome enough that people won't want to bother with it.
Yeah.
The way that I like to think of shotguns, and if I'm ever designing them for like an RPG or something like that, is that rather than losing accuracy over its range bands, it loses damage. And then it also lacks the ability to differentiate targets. Except right in point blank. Then obviously, yes.
Interesting. Okay, so it's more about damage over distance than it is about the accuracy per se.
I might call it that, like, if three guys are standing like right next to each other, there's a good chance that they might take up some amount of the damage. But in its effective range, a shotgun doesn't spread that much. And I think that's a thing that, like, video games and tabletop games sometimes exaggerate the scattering effect of it.
Yeah.
I've fired actual shotguns. I've tried them at different ranges. They do spread, but, like, in their most effective range, it's like maybe a foot. And most of that's probably going in one guy.
It seems like the classic video game interpretation is just like a big flak blast that doesn't really reflect how these things actually work.
And yeah, barrel size will matter, but like we're assuming that these shotguns don't have chokes in them that narrow the spray even more, because that's another way you could modify it. But I like to think about, like, even the fact that chokes exist suggests the idea that the point of it is not to hit a bunch of stuff out of the air, like, as you say, like a flak cannon. It's more to make hitting that one hard to hit thing easier to hit at the cost of, like, having to blow it away with a super high caliber round. That's just me. Other people might take exception to that. That's just from my own experience. And I like to, if I'm designing weapons for a game, I like to think about what they're intended to do, not necessarily how they scientifically work, because that might lead you to wrong conclusions about how they're used.
Well, I mean, if you look at the theoretical shooting range of a World War II rifle, you'd think the infantry combat happened at a very different range than it typically did. Because if you're exhausted and you're hungry and you're in a shell hole getting shot at, you have a very different effective range than the operational range of a weapon.
I mean, one of the most famous examples of shotguns being used in warfare is in World War I. And you're moving through trenches, and at a certain range, you pretty much hit the whole trench. And in that case, where guys are all grouped together, yeah, you probably are going to hit a bunch of people, at least a little bit. And one of them definitely a lot.
Right.
So I can see where that thinking comes from. But as I said, I don't think that that's why shotguns were built the way they are. Anyway, that's a tangent aside. I haven't even gotten into the lore of this thing, and we're already pushing time. So anyway, you got a whole range of weapons. The last one I'll mention here is a sniper rifle, which allows you to choose units, regardless of their position.
Right, cool.
And then it's got all the other things that you'd expect. And there's all sorts of other actions. Some of them make things work better, and some of them make it work worse. Okay, so the world of this game is set in our solar system. So it is an interplanetary, as opposed to, say, Warhammer 40,000, which is an intergalactic setting. And there are a range of these mega corporations which have subsumed nationality and any other kind of aspect. And so if you are a member of that corporation, you are essentially a citizen of it.
Passport and all, right?
Yeah, like it's a very Gibsonian view of a cyberpunk future.
Right.
So the factions in this game are, I guess, divided into 2 or maybe 3 groups. I'll explain why that's a little confusing. So you have the mega corporations themselves. And weirdly enough, though they are corporate, they take on the appearance of nationalities in our own world.
Right, right.
There's Capital, which is effectively America or the United States. They have a nice specialization with like airdrops and bombing, like, air bombing runs and things like that. And they're good balance of their firepower, mobility. They're sort of your all-rounder. They're your ultramarine kind of, with a few specialties thrown on top. Then you have your Bauhaus, which are Germans, and their uniforms look kind of like cyberpunk World War I armor. As I said, they look surprisingly like Deathcore of Krieg, but like if you can imagine bigger, bulkier armor, like if there was a Space Marine version of that.
Right.
Then you have Mishima, which are Japan. It's samurais, and they are melee focused for the most part. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Bauhaus is mostly, they have sort of preference or bias to armor and leadership.
Oh, interesting.
And I think they had some difficulty around, like, if their leaders get screwed up, then it has a pretty big repercussional effect. Mishima has like weird honor-bound rules. I wasn't quite able to fully grasp these, but it affects rallying and morale, I believe. And yeah, they're melee focused. Then you have Imperial, which are British. They look like World War I trench fighters with like weird teched out gas masks and like those pan helmets. They excel at having expendable troops. Oh, and artillery.
Oh, and arty. Yeah, there you go.
And then there's the faction of the mega corporations that doesn't necessarily fit into a nationality, which is called Cybertronic. I've heard some people kind of allude that they might be based on Soviets, but you could go either way on that one. Some artists depict them more as just kind of a cold, mechanized aesthetic. Some of them do have that utilitarian aspect, but they are sort of like over-specialized units in the sense that they have these really cool, devastating technology, but then they have a lot of weaknesses that come along with that. So those are your mega corporations. And on occasion, they can be mixed together in what's called the cartel. I'll get into how that fits in when I get the last 2 factions in here. After those, you have this separate dynamic. So all of these mega corporations fight each other. And then the new battle is between Brotherhood and Dark Legion. And Brotherhood, it's basically like cyberpunk Vatican.
Okay, got it.
So they are the predominant religion of the solar system. As I said, it's sort of like Protestant Puritans mixed with Catholic lore, but also neither of those things. And they sort of their philosophy is more humanist, but it has a spiritual component. And it has to do with like, having this sort of divine, they use something called the art, which is basically psionics. In their mind, it has to do with like human potential and what you'd expect. And then there's Dark Legion, which are just straight up demons that use zombies as infantry.
That's wild.
Oh, and monstrous horrors like mutants and things like that as well. But yeah, they use a lot of dumb zombie units. Oh, sorry, I was going to explain the cartel aspect. So you can actually field multiple corporations together as cartel units, which also have their own units, one of those being the famous Doomtroopers.
Okay, yeah, right on.
And the cartel is effectively the megacorps compromise for fighting the Dark Legion.
Oh.
It weirdly creates this kind of good guys, bad guys thing. So you can field units together. I think there are penalties or limitations for putting all of them in one basket. I think typically you have to have a certain number of dedicated cartel forces, which are strangely expensive compared to other units. And then you oppose those against Dark Legion. And Dark Legion also have sub-factions based on which one of these demons they follow. We don't have time to get into all of the dark seminary forces. But yeah, they have a bunch of, I think there are 5 demons, and then there's sort of an undifferentiated thing. I guess 5, so they don't look like Chaos from Warhammer. They have a lot of the same vibe. They're different when you look into the details, but they're basically fulfilling the same role that like the Chaos Legions do.
Yeah, I get that. So, well, what would you give me as your takeaway on this?
I don't know what to make of the setting. I have this difficulty grasping what I would call the handhold of the lore actually is. It's intriguing, and the game looks like it would be fun to play.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm not a big 40K player because I find the rules too broad. It just feels like units bumping into other units and then removing them.
I've had that experience a few times too.
Yeah. And I know that it's not always that, and there's definitely some wild card mechanics that come out. And sometimes my criticism of Warhammer 40K is that it leans sometimes too hard on the wild card aspects.
There are some gotcha moments.
Yeah. And the game always seems a struggle between balancing, is this an army game or is it a hero game? I mean, with fantasy, there was Hero Hammer, and then it fixed that, and then it was okay. And like, I get it. But the thing is, I like those very like moment to moment, character to character. I'm more of a skirmish guy. I like having those bespoke situational rules that are like, oh, well, I'm trying to shoot this guy, but he's sticking out of a tank. This is why I'm more of a Necromunda guy.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like that. It definitely fits. I would say gameplay wise, this is maybe more like Necromunda. Necromunda's got more edge case rules than this, at least this first edition does. And as I said, the addition to this then makes it more of a battlefield game. But
right.
I don't know. I like it. I want to play it. I've got all these things sitting around. I feel like I should use them for something. I mean, I do. But maybe for the game they were made for.
I have a hard time doing that. So I understand where you're coming from, but no, that'll be super fun, and we'll for sure do that.
Yeah. And yeah, I kind of bogarted this episode a little bit, but like, I guess I just have this very particular attachment to this game that I don't feel like I had much of a choice in. It's just sort of, it's always lurked around me.
It's fallen on you.
I know. It fell on me.
Yeah.
And I feel like I should explore it more. And so this episode is my attempt to do that and include everybody else with that exploration. But like, if anybody out there is like, or if you're a big Warzone guy or even just a Mutant Chronicles fan, like, let us know, like, what is it that you like about the setting? What is that handhold for you? What pulls you in that, say, something like, 40K or a different setting, maybe like Shadowrun or something in the sci-fi vein? What does this do that doesn't?
Yeah, that's cool. That's a good question, because every setting that launches and captures imagination has that burning third heat that helps make it special. So let us know what that is, for Warzone in your experience.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are people out there interested enough that people try to bring it back. So maybe you're one of those people. Anyway,
right on.
That will do it for this episode. Yeah, sorry if it was a bit of an avalanche, but I hope you all got something out of that. Before we go, got to announce that we're doing the next episode, which is about action economy. And it was kind of inspired by the AP or AC system in this game. Look forward to getting into that, and I hope you all join us.
Sounds great. Have a great one, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.